Da Vinci is one of a long line of artists who have told us, beginning with the ancient Egyptians and running through the early Christians and Tibetans, that art is a medium, it's a conduit.
For generations, people took it for granted that King Henry V was lying in peace inside a grand royal burial place. They were completely mistaken. When the chamber hidden beneath the chapel floor was finally uncovered, what it revealed left every single person who laid eyes on it absolutely speechless. The state of that vault was nothing like anything history had led anyone to believe, and what was found inside shattered every assumption anyone had ever made. Here is Henry V's tomb, and it is known that inside that chamber lie the bodies of Henry and Jane Seymour. That alone is a fascinating subject because there is a lost tomb connected to a king whose body refused to behave the way any body should. Henry V spent the closing years of his life in a condition that left everyone around him deeply disturbed. Accounts from inside the Tudor court, the royal household that surrounded the king day and night, paint the picture of a ruler who could not move from one place to another without people physically assisting him. The body that had once been celebrated for its strength and athletic ability had grown to a size that required specially constructed mechanical devices just to lift him out of bed each morning. His legs were consumed by deep open sores that showed no signs of ever closing. And according to people who were actually present, the odor coming from those infected wounds would fill entire rooms long before the king even arrived. Some physicians in later years suggested he may have carried a metabolic disorder that disrupted his weight and his circulation, though no one has been able to confirm it with certainty. What no one disputes is that his body was breaking down at a rapid pace, and the same king who had once charged boldly into tournaments on horseback was now a man consumed by relentless pain and fatigue. Several members of his court wrote privately that he appeared to be dying long before death actually came for him. When Henry finally died in January of 1547, the embalmers responsible for preparing royal bodies were confronted with a situation that went far beyond anything their established methods were built to handle. Tudor embalming was not a precise or consistent science. The standard approach relied on combinations of spices, oils, alcohol, and layers of linen wrapping to hold off the natural process of decay. These techniques could buy time with an ordinary body, but they offered almost no protection against a corpse that had already begun deteriorating before the heart stopped beating. Henry's size made everything harder. His body required a much larger coffin than usual, one that was lined throughout with thick sheets of lead. Lead coffins were designed to contain fluids and contain odor, but they also created a sealed environment where gases produced by decomposition had nowhere to escape. As those gases accumulated and built pressure, the coffin became something that could crack or rupture from within. The problems began during the procession that carried Henry's body from Whitehall, the royal palace in London, to Windsor Castle, where he was to be buried. Along the route, the procession paused overnight at Sion Abbey, a religious house situated not far from London. According to multiple written accounts from that period, something deeply disturbing took place during that stop. A dark liquid was reportedly observed seeping out from the coffin and spreading across the floor. Some later chroniclers even claimed that dogs managed to get inside the hall and were found licking at the fluid before attendants drove them away. Others insisted the incident was a sign from God, a divine judgment against a king whose actions during his life had been unworthy of mercy. Whether these accounts were accurate or had been stretched over time, they revealed just how deeply uneasy people felt about the state the king's body was in. Henry was then placed inside a temporary vault beneath St. George's Chapel. The arrangement was never meant to be permanent. During his lifetime, Henry had fully expected that his remains would eventually be moved into the enormous tomb he had spent years planning and commissioning. Jane Seymour, the wife who had finally given him the legitimate male heir he had chased for so long, was already resting inside that same vault because Henry had chosen her to lie beside him for eternity. But even as the vault was being prepared, quiet unease spread among some of those present. Certain attendants felt the burial had been handled too hastily and that something about the sealed coffin did not seem right. A few believed the lead casing was already responding to pressure building up inside it. These concerns were brushed aside and eventually forgotten entirely once the stone was set back into the floor. But that uneasy burial left behind questions that would go unanswered for many generations to come. While Henry's body was undergoing changes that Tudor embalmers had no framework to understand, a stranger story was already taking shape above ground, tied to a tomb he had spent decades designing but would never live to see finished. Henry V did not simply want a tomb. He wanted a structure that would dwarf every other royal burial in the entire country. His own father already rested in a beautiful chapel at Westminster Abbey, but for Henry, that was nowhere near enough. According to historians who have studied his plans, he wanted something on a grander scale, something darker and more commanding, a monument that would remind every future king that no one had ever wielded power the way he had. Cardinal Wolsey had once stood at the top of the English church and served as one of Henry's most trusted and powerful advisors. But when he fell out of favor, everything he owned passed to the crown. Among those seized possessions was an unfinished tomb Wolsey had been having built for himself. Henry took it and treated it as raw material to be transformed. Wolsey's planned monument had been an impressive piece of work, but when Henry looked at it, he decided it was far too modest for a king of his standing. He commissioned a completely new design, one that was larger, heavier, and packed with religious imagery. The tomb was to be encased in black marble and filled with gilded angels, prophets, apostles, and full-length reclining figures of Henry and Jane Seymour carved in meticulous detail. Work began on a scale that stunned even those who had grown accustomed to royal extravagance. Italian artists were brought across the Channel to England. Skilled sculptors and metalworkers were contracted and set to work. Plans were revised repeatedly as Henry demanded more figures, more decoration, and more symbols of royal triumph. A full-size likeness of Henry was cast while he was still breathing, so that his face in death would be preserved as the face of a man who never wavered. Workshops around Westminster filled up with carved pillars, towering candlesticks, and long relief panels depicting religious scenes and the imagery of kingly authority. The monument existed in dozens of separate pieces, waiting for the day they would finally be assembled into something that would fill its own dedicated chapel. That day never arrived. Military campaigns cost enormous sums, and Henry's wars against France and Scotland drained the treasury until nothing remained. According to surviving records, payments to the craftsmen slowed and then ceased entirely. The Italian sculptor packed up and went home. Assistants were let go. The unfinished monument sat untouched in storage while the king's attention and money shifted toward warships, soldiers, and fortifications. By the time Henry died, the instructions written into his will still described the tomb as nearly complete. He had drafted those instructions earlier, during a time when he still believed the work was moving forward. In reality, by his final days, no one was working on it at all. His children inherited his throne, but not his obsession. Edward, Mary, and Elizabeth each faced their own crises and their own demands. None of them had any interest in spending money or energy finishing a monument that existed purely to serve their father's vanity. Over the following years, the individual pieces were sold off, repurposed, or melted down for their materials. Part of the structure was eventually incorporated into the tomb of another figure considered a national hero. Other elements made their way to churches across the continent. The monument that was supposed to be the greatest royal tomb in English history quietly dissolved, piece by piece, while the king himself remained in a small vault that was never meant to hold him permanently. When Henry Fee was first sealed inside the vault beneath the choir of St. George's Chapel, everyone who was there knew exactly where it was. Clergy stood around the opening. Royal officials watched the stone go down. The workers who had built the chamber could have walked straight to it without hesitation. And yet the burial was always understood to be a temporary arrangement. That single fact set everything that followed into motion. Because the vault was considered temporary, no inscription was carved into the stone above it. No detailed record of its precise location was preserved for future reference, and no floor plan was kept to ensure it could be found again. It was sealed quietly, with the shared understanding that Henry would one day be transferred into the grand tomb he had designed. That day never came, and over time the location faded from practical knowledge. As the decades accumulated, the chapel changed again and again. Ceremonies filled it with movement. New choir stalls were built and installed. Old stones were lifted and relaid as part of ongoing maintenance. Repairs were carried out through periods of intense political and religious upheaval, and during those disruptions many documents were lost or deliberately removed. Even the clergy who served at the chapel began giving uncertain answers when visitors asked where Henry was buried. They would say he rested somewhere beneath the choir, but none of them could identify the actual stone beneath which he lay. The daily life of the chapel continued without interruption. Worshippers came to pray, boys rehearsed their singing. Officials and tourists walked across that same floor, completely unaware that they were passing directly above the remains of the king who had torn England away from Rome and redrawn the entire map of the country's religious life. Nothing set Henry's burial stone apart from any of the others. The vault had vanished in plain sight. Superstition made the situation worse. Some people believed that disturbing a royal grave would bring misfortune down on anyone who attempted it. Others spoke quietly about the ground beneath the choir feeling unsettled, as though it should be left alone. These anxieties discouraged anyone from searching. Many people simply assumed that Henry's great tomb must have been completed and placed somewhere else. The idea that he was still lying in a small unmarked underground chamber seemed too undignified to accept. The location was forgotten completely. The vault lay hidden beneath layers of stone, accumulated history, and silence, left undisturbed for generations until a sudden political crisis forced people to go looking for it again. When Charles I was executed, England entered one of the most unstable and dangerous periods in its history. Parliament was deeply worried that his burial site could become a gathering point for those who wanted to mourn him, honor him, or use his memory to stir up resistance. They insisted on a burial that would attract no notice whatsoever. There would be no public ceremony and no formal mourning. His body had to be moved quickly and placed somewhere that was controlled, secure, and unlikely to draw anyone's attention. Windsor Castle was the obvious answer. It was fortified, well guarded, removed from the turbulence of London, and firmly under parliamentary authority. According to some accounts, officials went searching for a location within the castle grounds that would be appropriate for a king's remains while keeping the burial as hidden as possible. During that search, someone remembered an old and vague reference to a vault somewhere beneath the choir of St. George's Chapel. It was described imprecisely, almost as a footnote, but it sounded like exactly what they needed. When workers pried up the relevant stones and looked inside, they realized they had stumbled across Henry Fee's burial chamber, which had been lost for generations. The vault had not been opened in all that time. It contained Henry Fee and Jane Seymour, both undisturbed in the darkness below. There was no time for deliberation. Charles's coffin was brought into the chapel and lowered in immediately. The work that followed was brutal and rushed. It was the middle of winter and the interior of the chapel was bitterly cold. The light available was poor, and the men working below were under pressure to finish as quickly as possible so that no one would notice what was happening. The careful ceremonial handling that normally accompanied a royal burial was entirely absent. Charles's lead coffin was extraordinarily heavy, and the vault was too cramped to allow the workers to maneuver it properly. They were forced to lift, twist, and muscle the coffin into position. In doing so, they unavoidably shifted the other coffins inside the confined space. Examinations conducted many years afterward indicated that the wooden frame supporting Henry Fee's coffin was almost certainly damaged during this chaotic process. Later observers came to believe that Henry's massive lead coffin, which had already been under severe internal pressure from the gases produced by decomposition, may have cracked or been destabilized at precisely this moment. Charles I now lay only inches from Henry, a pairing that carried a strange and unsettling irony. One king had stretched royal authority to its absolute limits. The other had tried to defend that same kind of authority and had paid for it with his head. Several historians have argued that placing the two so close together unintentionally reflected something deep about England's long and tortured relationship with the idea of absolute monarchy. Others maintain it was nothing more than a practical decision made by men working quickly in a dangerous situation with no symbolic intent whatsoever. Either way, the closeness of their coffins became one of the defining details of the vault's troubled history. Once Charles was inside, the stone was replaced and the vault was sealed again. It now held two monarchs. The damage caused during that rushed, improvised burial remained invisible, hidden in the darkness below until the vault was opened once more many years later. Only then would the consequences of that desperate winter night become impossible to look away from. The rediscovery of Henry Fee's vault did not begin with scholars or archaeologists. It began with ordinary laborers carrying out routine maintenance work inside the chapel. According to the accounts that survive from that day, the workers were in the process of lifting and resetting some of the older stones near the choir when one slab moved in an unexpected way. Before anyone could react, it dropped downward. A gap opened in the floor beneath their feet, revealing a dark, silent space that had not seen daylight in generations. The workers went still, some pulled back in alarm. Others leaned forward, trying to make sense of what they were looking at. A wave of cold, stale air rushed up from below. One worker reportedly said afterward that it felt as though the vault had breathed out after centuries of being sealed shut. Lanterns were lowered into the opening, and the light below revealed a cramped burial chamber containing 3 large lead coffins. The workers sent for officials immediately. When the first royal attendants arrived and peered down into the vault, they were able to identify Jane Seymour's coffin resting along one side. It appeared untouched and properly sealed. Charles I's coffin lay near hers. It showed the wear of time but remained structurally sound. Nothing about either of those two coffins suggested any serious disturbance. Then the lamplight shifted toward Henry Fee's coffin and everything changed. His coffin was in ruins. The enormous lead casing had buckled, split open, and given way in multiple places. The wooden supports that were supposed to hold it level had failed completely, leaving the coffin tilted at a severe angle against the vault wall. Long fractures ran across the surface of the lead. Sections of it appeared warped, bent outward as though something inside had pushed against the walls with tremendous force. Reports that emerged from that day claimed that several of the observers physically stepped back when they saw the state of it, either from shock or from concern that the weakened structure could shift further without warning. Royal officials were called within hours, and physicians came with them, because no one could say with any certainty what condition Henry's remains were in after so much time. The chapel, usually a place of quiet movement and soft echoes, became utterly still. Everyone who approached the opening described the same impression. The vault felt fragile and tense, as if even a small disturbance could cause everything inside to shift again. After the scene had been observed and assessed, officials ordered the vault to be sealed once more. They recorded what they had seen, but declined to open Henry's coffin further. They argued that the structure was too unstable, and that any interference could collapse the chamber entirely. The decision was made quickly, and the stone was put back in place, returning the vault to darkness. But even those observers had not yet uncovered the full truth. Roughly 75 years after that, during a formally sanctioned examination carried out under controlled circumstances, what was discovered inside Henry Fee's shattered coffin would finally be brought to light in a way no one could dismiss. When officials gave their approval for a proper survey of the vault, only a small and carefully selected group of individuals was permitted to take part. A surveyor was sent down into the chamber with a lamp, a measuring line, and a basic set of tools. Everyone else waited above the opening in complete silence. The entire atmosphere in the chapel was one of barely contained tension, as if the building itself were waiting. The surveyor began on the right side of the vault. Jane Seymour's coffin was there, sealed and perfectly level. She had been buried with care and proper preparation, and the lead showed no indication of stress or damage. Beside her, Charles I's coffin had aged but remained intact. It had survived the rough treatment of its placement and the long years in the dark, and its surface held firm. Neither of those two coffins gave any cause for alarm. Then the surveyor turned and directed his lamp toward the center of the vault. Henry Fye's coffin was a wreck. The lead casing had buckled and torn and collapsed across multiple sections. The wooden supports beneath it had rotted and broken completely away, leaving the coffin leaning against the wall of the vault at a steep and unnatural angle. Fractures ran the length of the surface. Sections of the metal had warped and bent outward, as though something trapped inside had pressed against the walls for years with relentless force. The surveyor moved his lamp closer and found exposed bone visible through one of the torn gaps. It was thick and dense, still partially wrapped in scraps of cloth and flakes of displaced lead. Historians who examined the report later concluded that this was almost certainly part of Henry's leg, forced out through the rupture by the same internal pressure that had destroyed the coffin around it. As the surveyor examined the floor around the collapsed supports, he noticed something among the fragments of rotted wood and broken lead. What he had initially taken for debris contained pale, jointed pieces. His notes described short bones consistent with fingers and what appeared to be part of a hand. The implication that fragments of Henry's body had been forced out of the coffin and scattered across the floor of the vault disturbed everyone who later read the account. Then the surveyor found something worse. In a narrow space between the coffins, in a position that did not correspond to any recorded burial, he discovered another cluster of bones. They had no connection to Henry's exposed remains. They were not near Jane Seymour's coffin. They were too far from Charles I's coffin to have come from it. There was no case around them, no identifying marker, and no entry anywhere in the chapel's records that could explain their presence. They were simply there, scattered on the floor of the vault in the dark, belonging to someone no one could identify. This discovery generated confusion that has never been resolved. And then came the detail that left officials reviewing the report genuinely unsettled. Near one of the fractures in Henry's coffin, the surveyor found a patch of dark, dried residue hardened onto the stone floor. He described it as a thick deposit that had set over a very long period of time. Several historians have noted that the color and the placement of this stain closely matched the dark fluid that witnesses reported seeping from Henry's coffin during the stop at Sion Abbey, decades earlier and miles away. Some researchers believe the residue escaped from the coffin long before the vault was sealed for the final time. Others argue that the internal pressure could have forced it out slowly over many years. The correspondence between the two locations, separated by so much time and distance, shook everyone who studied the documentation carefully. After this examination, the vault was no longer viewed simply as a damaged burial chamber. It had become a forensic puzzle, a disturbing scene of scattered remains and unanswered questions. Some historians argue that the unidentified bones were displaced from elsewhere in the chapel during earlier building work and moved into the vault without any record being made. Others believe the rough handling during Charles I's burial may have dragged them in from a nearby area. A smaller number of researchers put forward a darker theory, one for which no proof exists. They suggest that someone may have been placed there secretly during a period of political crisis, with the assumption that the vault would remain sealed and hidden forever. The theories vary, but the record does not. Henry V does not rest whole in a magnificent tomb. He lies in a shattered coffin with a leg bone protruding through torn lead, with finger bones scattered on the floor, with an unexplained set of human remains lying somewhere close by, and with what may be the same dark stain that first appeared during his funeral procession still dried into the stone beneath him. For a man who spent his entire life trying to control everything around him, his resting place became something he never could have imagined and never could have prevented. The discoveries made inside the vault forced historians and medical researchers to look again at Henry Fye's final years, this time with something closer to physical evidence. The exposed leg bone, described as unusually thick and dense, gave new weight to long-standing theories that Henry suffered from severe swelling and advanced chronic infection in his later life. Some medical specialists noted that the density of the bone matched historical descriptions of the kind of pain that left him barely able to support his own weight. The vault had unintentionally preserved physical material that aligned with what Tudor witnesses had written down at the time. The fragments of fabric still attached to the bone added another unexpected layer of information. They suggested that portions of Henry's burial garments had survived far longer than anyone would have expected in a damp underground chamber. Some researchers believe the collapse of the coffin pressed the cloth so tightly against the bone that it slowed the rate of decay. Others have proposed that the oils and spices applied during embalming altered the chemical breakdown of the material in ways that prolonged its survival. These fragments offered a rare and direct window into Tudor burial practices that are otherwise almost entirely lost to time. The unidentified bones created the most serious debate of all. They did not belong to Henry v. Jane Seymour or Charles I. Some experts propose that they came from a clergyman originally buried beneath the chapel floor whose remains were accidentally disturbed during one of the many rounds of renovation work carried out over the centuries. Others argued that during times of political crisis, displaced remains were sometimes placed temporarily in sealed locations and simply never moved again. A smaller group of researchers proposed something more troubling. They believe that someone may have been buried inside the vault deliberately and in secret during a moment of danger, because the chamber was sealed, invisible, and expected to remain that way forever. Without opening the vault again, none of these explanations can be confirmed or eliminated, which raises the question that has been sitting at the center of this story from the beginning. Should the vault be opened again so that the truth can finally be established? Or should whatever remains inside be left in the dark and the silence where it has rested all this time?